All right, so this warm-up is just a review of our normal distribution and that empirical rule that we started going over last class. So first things first, we're going to set up our normal curve. So it says the distribution of 100 students' IQs is normal with a mean score of 90 and a standard deviation of 12. So that means, right, my mean score is 90 and then my standard deviation is 12, means I'm going to add 12 over and over again until I get to this side. So then if I add 12 more, and then going the other way, I'm going to subtract 12 from both sides, or subtract 12 over and over. So this fills out my normal curve, right? My mean goes in the middle, and then each standard deviation from there. So remember, your empirical rule says that within the first standard deviation, 68% of results live within 1 standard deviation from the mean. Then 95% live within 2 standard deviations of the mean. And then 99.7 live within 3 standard deviations of the mean. So we can find probabilities or areas underneath the curve for these specific values just by using our empirical rule. So for instance, the first question asks, what percent of scores are between 78 and 102? Well, that's 1 standard deviation on both sides. So my empirical rule says 68%. My next one says between 66 and 114. So I'm 2 standard deviations from the mean on both sides. So the empirical rule says that the percentage there is 95%. Then it says what percentage of scores are between 54 and 126. So again, I'm 3 standard deviations from the mean. So then my empirical rule says that the area is 99.7%. So those are our most basic percentages just based off of the empirical rule that we have. So now, it doesn't necessarily have to be balanced on both sides for us to still be able to use these percentages. So for instance, this one says, what scores are between 78 and 114? So I want to know between 78 and 114. So I want to know this area, and I'm just going to lightly sketch it because we're going to erase it later. But I want to know that area here. Well, I'm only 1 standard deviation over on this side, but I'm 2 standard deviations over on this side. So the way that I do it, and there's a couple different ways that you can do it, so it doesn't necessarily have to do it this way, but I think about the fact that on this side of the mean, I'm 1 standard deviation over. Well, 1 standard deviation over on both sides would be 68%, but I'm only on one side. So I'm going to take that 68% and divide it by 2. And that's going to represent that area here. Then on this side, I'm 2 standard deviations over, again, but only on half of the graph. So I'm going to take my 95% and cut it in half, right? Because I'm not going all the way on both ends. I'm just on this half going over the 95%. So 95 divided by 2. So then if I take these two values, 68 divided by 2 plus 95 divided by 2, that would tell me those two areas added together. So 68 divided by 2 plus 95 divided by 2 would give me 81.5. Okay, so then let's look at the next one. And I'm going to erase this so I can hopefully have a fresh start. So the next one says, what are the scores between 54, so that's here, and 102? So I want to know this area here. So again, I'm not equal on both sides, right? On this side, if we cut it off at the mean, I'm 3 standard deviations over. On this side, I'm only 1 standard deviation over. So again, I'm going to take this half at a time. So on this half, I'm 3 standard deviations over, which means my empirical rule is that 99.7, but I'm only using half of it because I'm only going this way 3 standard deviations. I'm not going 3 standard deviations the other way as well. Then if I look at this one, I'm only 1 standard deviation over. So then that's 68 divided by 2, and that represents half of 1 standard deviation over. So then if I add those two together, 99.7 divided by 2 plus 68 divided by 2, I end up with 83.85. So that would represent my percent for this one. All right. It's going to get a little harder every time to erase, but we'll do our best so that we can draw our picture. So now it wants to know the percent of scores between 66 and 126. So I want to know this area here. So again, at the mean, I'm 2 standard deviations this way, but I'm 3 standard deviations this way. So let's talk about the areas that we know. If I look at this side, I'm 2 standard deviations over. So my empirical rule says when I'm 2 standard deviations over, I'm 95%, but I'm only using half of the picture. So I divide by 2. Then I come on this side, I'm 3 standard deviations over. So my empirical rule says that's 99.7, but again, I'm only looking at half of that, so I divide by 2. So then if I add up my 2 shaded regions together, it makes up the whole picture. So 95 divided by 2 plus 99.7 divided by 2 would give me 97.35%. Okay. So then if I go to my next one, I'm looking at what percentage of scores are more than 102. Actually, I'm going to skip this one and come back to it in a second. I'm going to look at this one first. What scores are less than 114? So I actually want to know all of the values below 114. So I want to know all of this. So what we haven't talked about yet, though this graph appears that it ends at 54, it keeps going past 3 standard deviations. It's just so small it can be hard to see, but it's going to keep going. So if I think about this half, I'm not just going 3 standard deviations over, I'm shading in this entire half of the graph. So then the area of this half of the graph would be 50%, right? It makes up 50% of the whole picture. So because I'm shading all the way to the end, not just to 3 standard deviations, but past that, I'm looking at 50% of my graph makes up this area. So then all I need to figure out is what this side is made of. Well, it's 2 standard deviations from the mean. So then if I take my empirical rule, my 95, and I'm only looking at half of it, so I divide by 2. So I take 95 divided by 2, and then I would add the 50% to it. So I get 97.5%, because I'm going to take the 50% that makes up the rest of this graph plus my 95 divided by 2. Oops, wrong. Good thing I wrote this in pencil. That was this question. Okay, so then this last one asks me to find the scores that are more than 102. So here's 102, and I actually want this shaded region here. Well, we haven't really talked about finding it when it's not in relation to the mean. However, this whole picture makes up 100%. So if I knew the area of this piece, if I do 100% minus the area of this, that would tell me this shaded region. Well, I can find the area of this. Remember, this half that we didn't shade in is 50%. Right? We just talked about that in the last one. I'm going all the way to the end of this graph. So that would be 50%. So now I just have to find this area here, which is 1 standard deviation from the mean. So that would be 68 divided by 2. So 68 divided by 2 is 34. Plus 50 is 84. So that means this whole area that I didn't shade in is 84%. So then the part that I did shade in is the rest of the full picture. So 100 minus 84 is 16%. All right, we're going to keep practicing with our empirical rule. It is kind of complicated to understand, and we're actually going to learn other processes that go outside of our empirical rule, but hopefully that review kind of like helped jog your brain of what we did last class.